Hello, everybody. Welcome to Exploring Reality. First live stream from the new house. Today, we are going to be talking about the Book of Acts and whether or not it is reliable. It'll also be a response to a YouTube video recently criticizing the Book of Acts and some of the maximalist arguments for the reliability of the Book of Acts. So stay tuned and enjoy the countdown while I bring in my guests. Okay, and I think I realized what was wrong with my mic, you guys. It was my camera mic going. So.
Oh, well, I'm glad you switched it before it got worse. Just went on for a whole show like that. That's a bad feeling.
Well, I got Stephen Boyce and my friend Erik here with me today. Why don't you guys introduce yourselves for anybody that doesn't know you? Erik, you've been on the channel before, but for anybody that doesn't know you, go ahead and introduce yourself as well. You can start with Stephen.
All right. Yeah, my name's Stephen Boyce. I'm with Explore Christianity, one of the apologists and one of the founders of that ministry, which actually branched off of Explain International, which is based out of Southeast Asia, particularly very heavy in Fiji and in Malaysia. Good friends with that group over there. Been working in apologetics for about the last 6 years. Finished my PhD about a year ago in canon and text, was the main emphasis, textual criticism and canonicity, most of which was on the canonicity side. So subjects like this are not new to me. I enjoy them. I actually have been delving into the Old Testament canon a lot more these days, but I will always forever love the New Testament canon and the discussion on that. Appreciate you both having me on. And if you want to learn more about our ministry, you can check us out at explorechristianity.net. We also have a Facebook, Instagram, Twitter. It's all there. You can find any of our videos. I also have a podcast I do called Facts, F-A-C-T-S, and it is a acronym, Fathers, Apocryphal Canon, Text, and Scripture. You can check that out. All my uploaded audio is on there as well for these shows. I've also been on Erik's show, I think, twice. I can't remember now.
We did it on the Gospel of Matthew. It was really, really good episode. So yeah, definitely.
Awesome. And I'm normally on top of that kind of stuff where I'm going to put the links into the description, but we just got done moving. So Stephen, I'll have all of that stuff in a description of the video for everybody that wants to come see your stuff. Erik, go ahead.
Yeah. My name is Erik Manning, and I run the YouTube channel Testify. I've been regularly publishing since for probably the last 20 months or so not too long. Mostly focused on historical apologetics, reliability of the New Testament in particular. Gospels, Acts was what brought this whole video up, as I did a series semi-recently on the Book of Acts. And I also talk about, the argument for miracles, and even occasionally we'll have videos on contemporary miracle claims and looking and examining those. And so, tonight we're going to be responding to a critic of mine who made a video responding to some of my older videos and then some of my newer videos on the Book of Acts. And so I wanted to get Stephen on here because he's just such a wealth of information when it comes to authorship and so many other things with the New Testament. And then we'll, just kind of get into it. The person who made the video, his name is Hats Off. And I believe he's got a pretty, I think he's educated in like New Testament and different things like that. I don't know exactly his background. I have talked to him here and there, like kind of over social media or in the comments section. And he is really smart guy, and I enjoy talking to him. Obviously, we just come down pretty differently on these issues, and so yeah.
Awesome. Well, that answers the question I was going to ask you, which is what are we doing today? But so I'm going to pull up the video here. So Erik, you kind of put together a clip of videos?
Yeah, it's a 36-minute long video. And so obviously, just for the sake of time, we're not going to be able to respond to all of it. I do highly recommend, and Dan, if you could, at the end, maybe put a link in the description to the original video.
Yep.
So that people can get the full context. And I don't want it to be like something like where we're just kind of quote mining and taking them out of context, but I condensed it down to kind of the high spots that I wanted to discuss.
Awesome. Well, I'm going to play the clip and then you just tell me when to pause it, okay?
Yeah, they'll have like little markers, but yeah, I'll tell you to pause.
Okay,
it.
cool. If I miss it, just tell me.
No worries. Yep. I made sure to monetize, so we're going to.
Unfortunately, this church tradition about the authorship of Luke and Acts can't be traced back beyond the late 2nd century of the Common Era. Perhaps the first reference to the tradition can be found in the Muratorian canon, which may have been written circa AD 170 to 180. As for the titles, the Gospel according to Luke and the Acts of the Apostles, well, there are problems there too. Most scholars view the 2-volume work of Luke Acts as originally anonymous, their traditional titles having been added later. How much later? Well, some scholars conjecture around 125 CE, but this is little more than an educated guess, and as such is not without its detractors. Martin Hengel, for instance, takes the view that the title of the Gospel of Luke was assigned very early, perhaps even originally by the author. Then again, it could be that the title was added later in the 2nd century, as scholars like Eugene Boring believe. Without more evidence, scholars aren't able to come to a firm agreement.
You can stop right there. And so basically, just to kind of set this up, I'm arguing for traditional dating at some point. Now, the video that he's responding to is really, I'm just arguing for traditional dating for all 4 of the Gospels. But yeah, that's kind of one of his objections to traditional authorship. So.
Gotcha.
Yeah.
Stephen?
Well, the thing that needs to be said off the beginning is he treats the Muratorian fragment as if it's the only 2nd century example that we have of a Luke-Acts combination. We actually don't. We actually have the anti-Marcionite prologue. We have Irenaeus. We have Tertullian. We have Origen. All of those, which are in the 2nd century. So the thing that has to be stated is that when we're doing canonical text or any kind of text, whether we're talking about the ancient past and the Greco-Roman world, or we're talking about Egyptian, whatever criteria we're following, I love how Augustine of Hippo actually gave the historical landmark. He gave kind of like 3 criteria of how do you navigate finding a original source or a writer or an author of an ancient document. And one of those things that, and these are my words, that he brings up multiple times is the importance of having an unbreakable chain of custody. So you have to have a person of interest. You have to start with that. And then you find that person of interest, find if that source is the only source that states as much, or are there 3 or 4 or 5? How many potential writers do we have of this document? And then from there, you have to investigate deeper into the evidence of each individual claim. Now, the thing that should be noted about Luke and Acts particularly is I think that most scholars, including the secular or a Christian, whether you're in a seminary or you're dealing in just a secular university, most would say that the writer of Acts is the same writer as Luke. The syntax is abundantly clear. There's too many things that are the same. There's too many structures, syntactical structures that are identical. The writer of one is the writer of the other. So if you could prove authorship in one, you're pretty much proving authorship in the other. But what has to be brought into the equation is, and he just brings up the Muratorian fragment as if like that's the earliest, and he doesn't say it, but he indicates as if that's the only, and it's not the earliest. Actually, Irenaeus is just as early, and then you have Origen is just early. Anti-Marcionite prologue is probably 2nd, 3rd century at best. I mean, when you look at these items, you have fathers, you have these writings, these documents, these fragments that are canonical setups and stories. When you look at them, they're all telling you the same name. See, what you don't have for Luke and Acts in history is any other person of interest. You don't have a second name. There is nobody else. There isn't a church, say, down in Alexandria who's saying that Barnabas wrote it. And then the church in the Rome is over here saying, well, no, actually it wasn't Barnabas, it was Titus. And then you have the church over in the East saying, well, no, it's Luke. And now you have a three-way discussion about who actually wrote it. You have unanimous church fathers, whether you're talking about Tertullian the lawyer, Irenaeus in the East, whether you're talking about the Muratorian Fragment from Rome, whether you're talking about the Anti-Marcionite Prologue, you're talking about Origen in Alexandria, wherever you are, you're finding, and Tertullian being in North Africa, being a part of the churches there, working as a lawyer, what you find is they're all telling you it's the same author. There is no one else that has been attached to these two texts, except for Marcion mutilating them and calling it the Gospel of Paul. And even then, he's admitting that Paul was behind that gospel. So that has to be dealt with too. But when you're dealing with this, there's no other person of interest. So to start running to anonymous authors when none are needed is faulty, because you have multiple attestation in multiple regions of individuals at multiple churches that didn't correspond with each other, coming up with the same author for the same exact text. And there is no 2 or 3 or 4 option elsewhere. So I don't like the way he starts this video. It's almost insinuative, like, well, we only have 2nd century, Muratorian Fragment. It's like, well, there's a lot behind that. It's not just the Muratorian Fragment. The Muratorian Fragment is connected to the same claim as Irenaeus, Tertullian, Origen, Anti-Marcionite Prologue. And then you go further, you go with Eusebius, or you go with Jerome. It doesn't matter who you put there. They're all telling you it's the same author. So to ignore that instantly, that unbreakable chain where you have consistency in pointing to an author is fallacy, because we would not treat any other ancient document that way. If you have a unanimous group, it doesn't matter if it's dealing with Islamic text, it doesn't matter if it's dealing with Greco-Roman text. If you have multiple attestations saying the same thing, we don't typically go into questioning that and defaulting to some, well, we really don't know, so it's anonymous. That's not how we handle any other work of antiquity. I don't understand why they, on that side of the argument, have to run to that mode for only these texts and no other. I think it's a bad way to go. Also, the whole thing of the title there that was mentioned, it's quite interesting that the title, it is possible that Luke would have had his own name written in there. And in fact, some of the early witnesses that we have say he did write it in his own name, in the sense of it wouldn't be in the text itself, but rather describing it. And that makes perfect sense. One, Luke's gospel has something the others don't. It has an audience or a person of interest who is addressing Theophilus in both Luke's account and in Acts itself. And if a person is being given a letter specifically with this content, the person that is being addressed should know where it came from. If you're who wants to receive an anonymous letter giving you all this information that's so useful to you, but they forgot to sign their name on it. You got to understand, these churches knew where their letters were coming from. And we can get into more on that as we go through this video. Right off the get-go, a title would have been necessary just on the basis of this was written to an individual and being addressed, and that individual would have had to have a way to know who gave it to him. So now I would agree that the earliest manuscripts and probably the initial text itself would have had Luke's name written on there with Theophilus being addressed.
Yeah. On that note, I'll just refer people to a paper. Excuse me, I tripped over my words there. Regarding the manuscript titles, there's a paper by Simon Gathercole, the titles of the Gospels in the earliest New Testament manuscripts, that I would just refer people to if they can get a hold of that, because he does go into that particular argument that obviously these weren't anonymous to the original recipients, and there was many ways that they could identify them that he talks about. And so, he's.
Just to add to that, Eric, just a quick rundown of that is why it was so important that the churches knew the carrier. And Paul was very careful in this. When he sent a letter out, when he was giving his epistles, he would often tell you, I'm sending so-and-so to you. And he would list them in the letter so that the carrier would match the writer's name, the name of of whom the writer is referring. So that way there was a chain of custody. Remember, they were forging letters in Paul's names. Paul knew that. I mean, that wasn't a surprise to him. He even said, if you get a letter that's allegedly from us saying these things. So Paul knew that his work was being forged, and he had his own signature in them. And he also had a carrier. He would send the carrier. That carrier would bring the letter. And if somebody else showed up with a letter that wasn't the person that's listed in the letter with Paul's signature on it, the church would have been on high alert. corruption was happening. The church knew of corruption was happening. The minute Marcion started mutilating Luke's gospel and perverting and working through Paul's epistles, the churches were calling it out from all over the world. They knew it didn't match the descriptions of what they had originally received from the apostle or the apostles themselves, and they instantly called it out. So there is a chain of custody when a letter is written, whether it's by the writer himself or he uses an amanuensis or more than one, and that carrier is designated to send, whether by horseback, ship, to these churches. And that chain of custody was a trust mechanism that the early church was using to protect from forged letters, because they were getting multiple letters in. You don't believe me? The beginning of Luke even admitted as much, that many had undertaken an attempt to write accounts of Jesus. Now, I don't think that Luke was necessarily saying they were all heretical, but they lacked something that gave them credibility. And the way that he used it in the aorist verb there indicates that they tried and they failed. And the reason they tried and they failed is because they were not written by the original eyewitnesses. They were written on secondhand reports. And so Luke's not going to make the same mistake his colleagues did by trying to do something from his perspective. He's going to actually interview the eyewitnesses themselves. So even in Luke's letters to Theophilus, he's indicating a lot of people have tried to put out stories and they didn't stick to the churches. Why didn't the churches take everybody's stories? They were only going to accept a letter from the apostolic group that had apostolic approval with an apostolic messenger who was connecting the church to the writer so that they knew it was authentic. And if it didn't, the church did not treat it as apostolic. It wasn't just the church was like, boy, I wonder what letter we'll get in the mail today. And if it's got some really cool stories about Jesus, and if they're cool enough, we'll keep them. If they're kind of boring, we'll disregard them. That's not how the church received the letters. That's not how they transmitted these letters and traveled with these letters. So I think that needs to be noted, Eric, in addition. And definitely check that out. But just kind of a quick hit. We have an unrealistic expectation about how the church handled letters at that time.
Cool.
Do you guys want to take questions at the end, or do you want to take them as we go?
I think it probably, well,
At
it's up
the
to, I would say end, but
Okay.
yeah.
Cool. Are you guys ready for the next clip?
Sure.
Yeah. Yep. Let's go for it.
And Eric, you pause.
As Arthur Bellanzoni sums up,
Go ahead.
there is no convincing evidence that Ignatius either knew or used the Gospel of Luke. Now, you may have noticed that even if Ignatius had quoted the Gospel of Luke, that still wouldn't have helped establish any kind of unbroken chain of evidence that Luke was its true author. Whether Ignatius knew the Gospel of Luke or not, the fact remains explicit references to Luke's work never appear in Ignatius. In other words, even if Ignatius really is using Luke, he doesn't call it the Gospel according to Luke or attribute it to Luke the physician. He doesn't say anything about Luke. In fact, it looks like the earliest extant reference to the author of Luke Acts by name might be the Muratorian canon, but it doesn't date until at least the later 2nd century.
Okay, you can pause it there. And so basically the argument that he's responding to here is that I'm saying that it's not just that these names are attached to these Gospels later, but I'm also saying that they were being used authoritatively in the church through Ignatius. He chose to focus particularly on Ignatius, even though Polycarp quotes Luke Acts, as well as I think even the heretic Valentinius quotes Luke. You also have Justin Martyr quoting Luke. And then you get Irenaeus, who actually names Luke. And so that's what he's reacting to there. And so my point is that they're making early use of these books because they believe that they're authoritative, and they're probably not going to be using anonymous books as authoritative. And so just kind of setting that background information there. So Stephen, what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, so I was wondering why he picked Ignatius out of all of them. I'm actually pulling up my dissertation data right now because Ignatius to the Smyrnans does quote Luke 24:39, and I can't share my screen, but I'd show you. But the way I did it in my dissertation is any alleged quote from a church father of any New or Old Testament, because most of them were quoting the Septuagint. I put out the wording side by side in the Greek, and any comparative work. I did letter and colors. So if it was a matched word, it was red and red to match them. If it was the same word but in a different form or something like that, I'd highlight it in green. If it was a variant, I'd highlight it in blue. And that's how I did my entire database for my entire dissertation. And so through my research on Ignatius specifically, because he brought him up, although he's not the earliest, but nonetheless, Ignatius does to the Smyrnians quote Luke 24:39 from my records of my dissertation. And more importantly, First Clement quotes Luke quite a bit. First Clement's first century. Didache quotes Luke 5 times. I was looking to see how many times First Clement did, because I know it's quite a few. Didache, though it favored Matthew the most, it does still quote Luke 5 times. There's multiple writers who utilize Luke's gospel even into the first century. So Luke's gospel was around at least by 90 AD, because you have First Clement, which is dated anywhere between 90 to 96 or closer maybe to 98. Didache is around the same exact time. Some would place the Didache even earlier. Some would place it all the way back to 60. I think it's a little bit unrealistic, but nonetheless, I would just say first century. So Luke's gospel is being regularly utilized in the first century by 2 documents that we have. Polycarp, as you mentioned, Eric, does refer to it again, but you have to understand Polycarp's significant because he was trained by an apostle. So you have Polycarp, who is trained by John the apostle himself. He spent time with him. He tells stories. Irenaeus, who was trained by Polycarp, tells stories of their time together in Ephesus, things that he learned, their episode of running into Cerinthian, and all these different stories that you have. But he was connected to John the apostle himself. He's utilizing it. One of the things that needs to be noted, and Eric, I know you've probably brought this out in your programs quite a bit. There's only 4 gospel records being quoted by anybody. No, it doesn't flat out say in every circumstance, John said this, and Peter, and Mark said that, and Luke said that. No, it doesn't say that. But what you have to deal with, even if you don't think the original names listed on the traditional names, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, are listed on, you still have to deal with the reality that the church was utilizing them as authoritative apostolic texts. Mm-hmm. So if the church was using them as apostolic texts, they still have to go back to an apostle. See, even Marcion knew when he was mutilating Luke's gospel, he literally removed any content that was not Pauline. And what was Pauline, he utilized. But here's what Marcion recognized. Luke's gospel traced itself back to Paul in some way. Now, if we just read the church fathers, they all told us that Paul authorized Luke to do this. Luke did the groundwork, but Paul authorized it. Why? Luke's not an apostle. Luke doesn't have the authority to just go writing text out and giving them to the church. He was a later Christian, probably saved under Paul's ministry, perhaps. He came later. He wasn't there. He didn't see Jesus. He didn't know Jesus. He wasn't with Jesus. Therefore, for him to write his own personal opinion, he would have ended up in the same category that many who undertook accounts as well, because he would have been no better than them. What was different between Luke's account that stuck to this day, where the many did not, that were his companions? The difference was apostolic authority behind the text. That's the difference. So whether you want to put it as Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, what's undeniable is their apostolic text that the churches used as authoritative. And I was actually going to pull up Clement. I was too busy talking. How many times Clement used it in his letter to the Corinthians? Let's see, New Testament. He only 2 times, but in a big letter like that, but he still uses Luke. I mean, he uses Matthew, he uses Mark, he uses Luke, and more. And in addition to that, he uses Acts twice. So first century using Luke and Acts, the Didache also using Luke and Acts. And actually, what's interesting about the Didache using Acts, just kind of as a side note, it uses a textual variant in one of the readings in Acts 2 when it's quoting from it. That is in one of the earliest manuscripts we have, but no more. Codex D, known as Codex Bize. It has a unique reading that is only found in that one manuscript. So it could be that what the Didache was utilizing and that early manuscript was utilizing was the same readings. All that to say, the first century church was using Luke and Acts already in the first century. Ignatius did as well. They all did. They all talked about it. So again, do they specifically say in them, Luke said this? Well, no, they don't do that. They don't do that for Paul a lot of times. Mm-hmm. I can show you multiple quotations in Ignatius's writings where he is using Paul's epistles and never once says Paul said. Not once. Multiple places. And nobody's disputing whether those are Paul's letters. The point of a New Testament writer to a church that's an apostolic church, especially Ignatius, who was trained on the apostles, he's not going to write to them and have to remind them over and over and over again who said those words. They already know. They already received those letters. For Ignatius to add their names in at every quotation would be pointless to a people. Just like if somebody keeps quoting to us statements out of the preamble or early church document or our early country documents that we have, the Declaration of Independence, reading the first line, we don't need to know the name of it, the document, in order to know what they're reading and what they're quoting, because we already know where they came from. We're familiar with them. The churches knew these texts. They're only quoting these 4 gospels, no more. Only 4. All of them, only 4, no more. And in those 4, they're constantly telling the churches the truths about what they say. They don't have to remind them of who the authors are. They already know. So how do we know that the churches knew who they were? Because the leaders of those churches, Irenaeus is a bishop. You have Clement of Alexandria as a leader. He became a bishop. You have all of these church fathers, these lawyers like Tertullian. They're telling us the story. They are unraveling the documents. The people just writing epistles to the churches don't need all that information. It's already common knowledge of the church. But these other guys are coming in and giving the history of it and defending the history of it to those who are coming in and attacking it from the outside. That's where you're going to find the meat of the writers and their origins, is from people who are on a defense, not from the churches who already know where they came from, if that makes sense.
Yeah, it's a reaction because of the challenges that are coming out, where those challenges weren't there before. Cool.
Their hand is forced. Their hand is forced to answer. Tertullian's a lawyer. He fights it like a lawyer. They're writing against Marcion because Marcion's coming out and corrupting something. So they're setting it straight. They're making a legal defense of their documents because somebody was mutilating them. So they were calling it out. So naturally, they're going to go through that. Ignatius has no reason to do that. He's writing to churches that were started by the apostles who would already have these documents on hand. Why would he need to constantly say, well, Paul said this and Luke said that and Matthew said? He doesn't need to do that. It's unnecessary.
Right. Well, and we even see in 2 Peter, whatever you think about Petrine authorship, which I think Peter wrote it, but that's a whole other live stream. We know that Paul's letters were already being circulated because he refers to Paul and people confusing the things that were written down. It assumes not just a few letters, but multiple letters, even at that early stage of the church as well. So,
yeah, and even the Muratorian Fragment, which he mentions, actually says that he lists 2. He said there were others, but there were 2 epistles that he lists by name that were forged in the name of Paul that circulated in the church based on Marcion. And it's the epistle of Paul to the Laodiceans and to the Alexandrians. So even the Muratorian Fragment's telling you there are other epistles circulating with Paul's name on them. But what did the church do with them? They rejected them. Why? They knew they were forgeries. They came later. Again, the churches were high alert. They knew what was and what wasn't from the apostles because of that chain of custody that we talked about earlier.
Awesome. All right. I think we're moving on to dating, unless you want to add anything else. Anybody?
You guys are doing everything that I would possibly say and more. So there's no point in me adding anything. So
right.
Let's go to the next clip.
In support of this view, Mr. Manning cites Adolf von Harnack, quote, St. Luke's absolute silence concerning everything that happened between the years 64 and 70 AD is a strong argument for the hypothesis that the book was written before the year 64 AD, unquote. Now, it's certainly not lost on Mr. Manning that this is an argument from silence, the very type of argument that he himself agrees is often weak and unconvincing.
It's not always necessarily fallacious, but at best, it's a pretty precarious way to argue. Exactly how reliable is our intuition at predicting whether a writer would mention a fact or event that did really happen? As it turns out, not so great.
So does this argument from silence about the date of Luke Acts hold up? Well, the basic problem here is that nobody knows why the Lucan story ends where it does. I mean, after all, the ending of Mark's gospel is equally abrupt, and yet nobody suggests that it ends where it does because the author knew no more. And there are plenty of other very plausible reasons that Luke might have had for choosing that spot for his ending. For instance, maybe Paul died at the end of the 2 years, but Luke suppressed this fact in order to end the narrative on a positive note, to be more edifying. On the other hand, it's entirely possible that Luke just didn't know what had happened to Paul or to Peter and simply terminated his account when his data ran out. Or maybe instead Luke did know what had happened to Paul, but didn't consider it necessary to note, maybe because it wasn't critical to his project in Acts, or because he could have.
So he's comparing apples to oranges here. I mean, you're talking about Mark and you're talking about Luke, and this is the problem with treating all gospels equal. In the sense of, like, I believe they're all equal in the sense of their authoritative text, but they're not equal in their purpose. They're not equal in their audience. They're not equal in their writer. And Mark ends abruptly because the format in which Mark was written was completely different from what Luke was doing. Mark is collecting oral tradition from Peter. I mean, there's no dispute about that in the early church. I know that they will dispute it, but there's zero dispute about that in the early church. Even starting with the earliest first century witness on that with Papias. I mean, there is no doubt that when you're talking about the evidence, not an opinion, an evidence that comes from the churches, Mark was a person who pinned down the oral traditional teachings of Peter's sermons in Rome, put them to written text. And again, we don't have time to pull up screen stuff. I can show just in Mark's gospel how many transitions are clearly abrupt, where it is equivalent to multiple other ancient works where you're taking something from an oral tradition and somebody is writing it down on behalf of that person to give them a written text for their oral tradition. Mark is doing just that. So Mark's going to stop where Peter stops teaching. That's the way he's going to do it. He's not writing a treatise. He's not writing a history in that way. He's writing a record, knowing that the churches in Rome needed the sermons of Peter long after he died. Peter's life was constantly in jeopardy. All the apostles' lives were constantly in jeopardy. The minute Peter dies, the oral tradition dies with them. But if they could take his tradition and put it to pen and paper, it'll live on. And that's what Mark did for Peter. But the way Mark did it is different. To bring Luke into that and say, well, Mark ends abrupt. Yeah, but Luke has not shown that kind of pattern yet. He's a historian. He's writing as a historian. You go to, again, most would say that Luke and Acts are the same writer. Is that how Luke ended? What you should be comparing Acts to is how Luke ended, not how Mark ended. Because you have the same format, same style, and again, even secular scholars agree, same writer. How did he finish his stories? We already have a narrative from Luke. He does not end abrupt. In fact, he gives a fuller ending to what happened with the other apostles. And he tells a story of two of the disciples on the road of Emmaus, one of which he names out loud because that would have been his eyewitness who gave him that information, and silences the other because that's good first century historian technique to give credibility to the eyewitness. And two people were at the scene and only one of them reported what happened. You don't give credit to the person you didn't talk to. You silence them and give credit to the person you do talk to. That's good first century historian technique. And so that's what he does with Cleopas. That's not the pattern of the writer who wrote a first treatise to the same person. So comparing Acts' ending to Mark with different styles, genres, and purposes of writing, rather than comparing Acts to Luke's first writing, is faulty. It's a faulty comparison, and it's honestly a little bit dishonest when dealing with the data. I don't know what you think about that, Eric, but that's the first thing that pops into my mind.
Well, he mentioned that I don't like the argument from silence, but what you just said there, Stephen, is not an argument from silence. It's an argument from what the author is actually like, which there's a big difference from that. And I also asked Lydia McGrew, whose husband Tim has written a very important article on the argument from silence that's been published. I forget the philosophical journal that it was published in. And she kind of concurs with a lot of stuff that you say. I'm actually have a video that'll be coming out this week with the same information. I'm just going to read kind of her response because somebody asked her in a group that I'm in about this particular thing. Isn't this just an argument from silence? And she says that I'd say the absence of the death of Paul is highly relevant, especially strong in the larger context of evidence concerning what the author is like. The author seems to have been following Paul's movements in some detail toward the end of the book. There is independent evidence that the pastoral epistles, which we might touch on here later, were written after Paul's first imprisonment, and the book of Acts ends with Paul's first imprisonment. The book was written for a particular individual, Theophilus. And she says, so why think that the author would have sat around with that book so long after its last recorded events instead of sending it to Theophilus? Would he really wait for more than 10 years to send the book to its intended recipient? And the absence of Paul's much-awaited hearing, she mentions, before the emperor seems to be a strong argument. Even if it is an argument from silence, it's not the same. There's strong arguments from silence and there's weak arguments from silence, right? If I were to sit here and tell you that there's no elephant in this room right now, that's technically like an argument from silence, but that's probably a pretty good one because there isn't one, right? But if I said, well, there's not a spider in the room right now, well, I'm not necessarily a real good judge of that. There could be some spiders in this room right now. I just don't see one and it's hiding. And so anyway, she says that the absence of Paul's much-awaited hearing before the emperor seems to me to be a strong argument from silence here because the book has been building up a lot of interest surrounding that particular hearing. And Luke likes court scenes. And as we know,
Yes.
Luke has court scenes, multiple court scenes. Like he's got them before the Sanhedrin, I think. He's before the high priest. He's before Agrippa and Felix. And again, we're bringing in specific information about the book and the author. These aren't just mere generalizations. And so it's not a weak argument from silence really whatsoever. Now, I'm not necessarily, even in the videos, I wasn't using these as like, these are just knockdown arguments. This is a probabilistic thing here. And I'm just saying that the evidence seems to fit better on early dating than it would on a late
cumulative case. Yeah, you're making a cumulative case.
Right, exactly.
And with that, I think that's a great point by McGrew, going through that, Eric. For the writer to stop at Paul's happy ending imprisonment compared to his second one, which was death, the writer of Acts was wanting you to know the stories of martyrdom. I mean, he tells you of Stephen's martyrdom. He tells you of James's martyrdom. The early church was very, very helpful in telling us stories of James the Just's martyrdom, going into Polycarp's martyrdom. Ignatius was all about his martyrdom. We talked about him. I mean, he was saying that if he went into the Colosseums and the animals weren't hungry, he was going to pretty much tick them off and make them eat them anyway. Like he was looking forward to his martyrdom. I mean, when you talk about the heroics, if you're going to paint Paul out to be a hero, the best way to do it is tell the story of his second imprisonment, which led to his martyrdom, rather than his first one, which was just on house arrest. That's not an exciting ending. But the argument from silence is really not true either when it comes to trying to bring an idea of when Luke's writing was. No, Luke didn't sit there and say, now, in the year of our Lord, 62, like he didn't do that. And obviously they didn't use a dating system at that point. I'm just saying, like, I'm being sarcastic, but with that, we do have a way to kind of break down when Luke's gospel was written in addition to Acts. And we have two documents to do this. And Eric, I don't know if you ever watched my videos on Luke or saw any of the content on it from the anti-Marcionite prologue, as well as the Muratorian fragment, using those two documents to actually get a 3-year span of when the Gospel of Luke was probably written. But just kind of reading the anti-Marcionite prologue and the Muratorian fragment, let me pull it up for you. It says the Muratorian fragment, the third book of the Gospel is that according to Luke. Luke, the well-known physician, after the ascension of Christ, when Paul had taken him as his companion of his travelings, composed it in his own name. So the Muratorian fragment is telling us, the one that your opponent mentioned, it is telling us he did compose it in his own name. The earliest format of Luke was in his own name, according to general belief. Yet he himself had not seen the Lord in the flesh, and therefore, as he was able to ascertain events, so indeed he begins to tell the story of the birth of John. Now, if you go into the part where it goes into Luke, it's of Acts and Luke, it says, moreover, the Acts of the Apostles were written in one book, for most excellent Theophilus, Luke compiled the individual events that took place in his presence, as plainly as shows by omitting the martyrdom of Peter, as well as the departure of Paul from the city of Rome when he journeyed to Spain. So the Muratorian Fragment is telling us what you just said, Eric, that it does not cover Peter's martyrdom. And again, if the two main apostles that are keyed in on in the gospel, or excuse me, in the writing of Acts is Peter and Paul. Like, that's the two main guys. You tell their great stories of transformation and conversion and their preaching and the church is being formed and all the wonderful things and acts that they did in front of the people. The one thing that you would want to include if you are a person like Luke, who's a historian, who has already wrote a treatise of Jesus's life, is to finalize their story with their death and their martyrdom. Why wouldn't you want to tell about Peter and Paul's martyrdom? That would make them heroes in the church. Like, honestly, if the church wanted any kind of information toward the end of their lives that would make them heroes, it would be to record their martyrdoms. But he didn't. But in that, you have a couple things. And going back to the anti-Marcionite prologue, it says, indeed, Luke was of Antiochian Syrian, a doctor by profession, a disciple of the apostles. Later, however, he followed Paul till his martyrdom, serving the Lord blamelessly. He never had a wife. He never fathered children. He died at the age of 84, full of the Holy Spirit in Boeotia. Therefore, although Gospels had already been written, indeed by Matthew in Judea, Mark in Italy, moved by the Holy Spirit, he wrote down this Gospel in the parts of Achaia. Indeed, afterwards, the same Luke wrote the Acts of the Apostles. Now, what we can do with those two documents, I mean, in a summary here, by the way, I find this unique that the anti-Marcionite prologue and Muratorian Fragment did not lack detail about Luke. They both say he was not a Jew, basically. He was not with Jesus, but that he was Syrian. So he was actually a Gentile. He was a physician. They both said he was a physician, as Paul said so in Colossians 4. He was a disciple of the apostles, specifically Paul, not Jesus. He died at 84 in Greece. Never married, never fathered children. That's a very specific detail. All right, I mean, if you're going to make that up, just round up to 85. He lived to be 85. Like, there's a lot of detail here. It's detail of his life, his age, his travels with Paul, his birthplace, where he died. He died in Greece at 84, specifically in Boeotia, inside of Greece. Didn't have a wife, never had children. He wrote the gospel in parts of Achaia, and he wrote the book of Acts. So if we take I give a hypothesis of dating Luke's gospel and attaching that into Acts based on those two documents, second century documents. He started traveling with Paul around 50 to 52. If you go to Acts 16, 50 to 52, he starts with Paul. This is where you start seeing the we, us, and our. The writer starts including himself, not by name, but by pronoun, into the text. The Muratorian Fragment states that he wrote while traveling with Paul. So it was sometime after 50 AD to 52 AD. The anti-Marcionite prologue says that it took place while in the area of Achaia. So now Paul was there on a couple of occasions. Once after that we, us, and our scene. The main time frame would be Acts 19 when Paul was over there, which puts you around 55 to 56 AD. It's here that Paul wrote probably the 2 Corinthians, and Luke and Titus would have delivered that letter for Paul to them. This timeline works with Luke gaining proper documentation from the apostles and the eyewitnesses in Jerusalem and Antioch, because he did spend over a year with the apostles when Paul was there, going back to Acts 18. So if Luke ever got information from eyewitnesses as a traveling companion of Paul in the narrative of Acts, can you find a scene where the we, us, and our person, even if you don't believe it's Luke, just the we, us, and our writer, with Paul, was he ever in Jerusalem and in Syria region with Antioch where he was with the eyewitnesses and the apostles? Yes, Acts 19. He was there for just over a year. Then he spent time in Caesarea. He tells us later that he spent time with Paul in the house of Philip and his 4 daughters for a few nights. That's where he received information like the story of Philip and the Ethiopian eunuch in Acts 8. He would have collected data from those visits with Paul. So there is a time where he could have received this information to get material to write a gospel narrative. This was also maintained consistency with the testimony of the early fathers that Paul said the phrase, according to my gospel, multiple times. According to my gospel, he says it in Romans. He also says it in 2 Timothy. And in 1 Timothy, when he uses that phrase, the early church father said he was always referring to the gospel of Luke. And in fact, when Paul's letters, when you're talking about the story where he's giving the night Jesus was betrayed and they do the Eucharist, he uses Luke's format for telling the story of the night of betrayal. When you go over to when he speaks of Jesus saying, you will not muzzle the ox when it carries out the grain, but a laborer is worthy of his hire. That phrase is explicitly word from Luke's gospel. Paul would have been quoting it by the time he wrote to Timothy in his second journey, already quoting Luke's gospel and calling it in 2 Timothy, my gospel, according to my gospel. So that would have been connected there. But based on these two documents, you do have, he says it's an argument from silence. It's not from silence. We have two ancient documents. We have the Muratorian Fragment, we have the Anti-Marcionite Prologue that are 2nd century based. And if you take the data of where he wrote when he traveled with Paul and you take Acts and you follow the pattern, you can actually date Luke's gospel between 56 and 58 AD. Just using those two documents. Does that absolutely prove it? The argument's over? No. But you have two ancient documents in the 2nd century that are telling you specifically how and when and where this was written, and that it was written in parts of Greece by Luke during that time period of traveling with Paul between 56 and 58 from the information he received when he spent a year with Paul with the apostles in Jerusalem and Antioch, and then he spent time with Philip and his daughters in Caesarea. He would have accumulated this information. He would have written out a script following the gospel. And then into Acts, he would have gotten all the information he needed from the apostles about what happened on Pentecost. He would have gotten that when he spent time in there in Jerusalem and Antioch. He'd have learned what Peter said there because he would have met Peter and Paul met Peter. He would have gotten that information from them. And then he would have carried on and took all the other stories of Philip. Once he met him in Caesarea, he took his account and wrote it for him. And then the rest of it was Paul's account, because that's where the rest of his time was spent. It matches. It works. The timelines work. Does it make it 100% true? No, but it's a good argument for it because it is not an argument from silence. It's the only arguments in history we do have. And just to throw them out as unimportant is unwise, and we wouldn't do that with any other work of antiquity.
No cap. Sorry. I've been doing the dumb Zoomer memes lately, and so that was awesome.
Funny. I didn't see that coming.
Yeah. So
I just don't like the statement. It's an argument from silence. It's not silent. We do have stuff to work with here.
Right, for sure. All right. Well, we are
ready for the next one.
Yeah. We probably should keep her moving here.
Assume that all this readers already knew the apostles' fate. And we can spin these possibilities all day, but the bottom line is that it's pure conjecture to impose on Luke what we think he would have or should have included in his narrative. That sort of thing just can't be a decisive piece of evidence for dating the documents.
We just keep going.
Okay.
Yep.
To be fair, though, it looks like Mr. Manning may now be rethinking his views about this. Remember his argument from silence we talked about earlier? Well, just a couple of weeks ago, I asked him how he feels about those kinds of arguments nowadays, and he replied very simply, quote, "I wouldn't make that early dating argument anymore. I'm more interested in signs that the gospel authors were close up to the facts and truthful when they wrote," unquote.
Okay, so stop there for just 1 second. So this was a comment that he left when I talked about Bart Ehrman talking about, Jesus would have never said, "Before Abraham, I was, I am." That's something that was only in the Gospel of John. And I was pointing out that that's just an argument from silence, right? And so he was like, well, what about when you talk about dating the Gospels? The specific argument that he's using is I bring in a bunch of different data. And some of the data I probably wouldn't bring in now, like, say, the destruction of the temple or something like that. Like, why doesn't Luke mention that? There's different parts of that particular argument that I wouldn't use anymore. But I just thought it was kind of strange that he spent all that time talking about dating when I'm even telling him, like, I would make a different argument now. So I found that to be just personally like a tiny bit frustrating because it's just like, why bother if you know that I would make a different argument, and people do change. That was like one of the very first videos that I ever made. And I'm not even saying it was like particularly good. I'm just running through some crummy slides, and it was like over 2 years ago. And so, yeah, I just kind of took exception to that. So, but it's not like a huge deal, but generally, like if somebody already tells you my views have evolved, you probably want to criticize like, what's your current view now? Let me criticize that. Don't, so I'm just calling that out as a faux pas. It's not something that I should be doing. If I'm criticizing somebody else's argument, I don't think anybody should be doing that. So, but it's not a huge deal. We'll let that pass. You can keep going.
We'll let it pass.
Sounds good.
I guess I didn't really let it pass, but you know what I mean.
And
was like,
Titus
just
form a
with an extra
collection known
comment.
as the Pastoral Epistles. And he also knows that most scholars are persuaded that they're post-Pauline and pseudonymous. In other words, they were written by an unknown author who wrote in Paul's name, even if that meant deceiving the faithful. This judgment concerning the Pastoral Epistles depends less on a single argument than on the convergence of a whole series of arguments. Shown here in the slide is a convenient list provided by Martin Debelius and Hans Konzelmann. Obviously, we don't have time to go through all of them here in this video, but I did want to just briefly mention 2 pieces of evidence that I personally find very striking. First of all, if we look at the most ancient collection of Pauline epistles known to us, that's the collection formed by the heterodox teacher Marcion, we find that his collection does not contain the Pastoral Epistles. Aha, well, that's interesting. But then traditional Christians might say, yeah, he was a heretic. What does he know? And so maybe we might want to look instead at the earliest manuscript collection of Paul's letters, something we can actually physically examine. Well, the oldest and most extensive manuscript of the collected letters of Paul is found in the Chester Beatty Papyrus P46. That's commonly dated between 200 and 225 CE. Now, the last pages of the manuscript are lost, but in the judgment of most scholars, 46 didn't contain the Pastoral Epistles either.
Okay, so
did you want me to stop there? Or?
No, you could stop there. So basically, part of my argument is that Paul is quoting Luke's gospel, because if you look at I think it's 1 Timothy 5:17, 5:18, somewhere thereabouts, he quotes the Old Testament. You should not muzzle the ox that treadeth out the corn, and then he says a laborer is worthy of his hire, which is Luke 10:7. And so I'm saying that this is kind of an argument for early dating, because I believe that there's good evidence that Paul wrote the pastoral epistles, which he's, I would say, poo-pooing. And then he's just saying that even if that was the case, that's probably, he's not necessarily quoting Luke's gospel. It could be some other tradition or something like that. So I saved that clip in there, Stephen, because I thought you might be interested in talking about that one. So,
yeah. So I find it ironic that he brings the pastorals in it. That helps me understand, because I was kind of confused. Like, all right, so why is pastorals relevant to this? And I guess it's because you made the comment that you quoted that part, which I'd mentioned myself. So what you have to deal with is that the Gospel of Luke document does precede these. But again, I mean, when you're talking about the writings of 1st, 2nd Timothy, and Titus, 1st Clement quotes them all in the 1st century. He quotes 1 Timothy and Titus. Polycarp quotes 2 Timothy 3 times, 1 Timothy twice. Oh, I'm sorry, 3 times as well. And so they're early quoted. They're there very, very early on. Early 2nd century, like Polycarp, and late 1st century by Clement. But
he disputes Polycarp as well.
Yeah, of course he does. But one of the things that he made mention of is a couple of things. A lot of Paul's pastoral epistles are usually together. A lot of manuscript forms. He made a very important statement that he treated as unimportant, and that is P46. We don't have the whole manuscript. We don't know if it would have had it or not. That is an argument from silence. If it was a complete codex, we could have that discussion. It's not a complete codex. We can't have that discussion with certainty. Either way, it doesn't matter. Like, you can't say it should have and would have, or it is or isn't. You can't argue either way for P46, because it is incomplete. We don't have the whole manuscript. And if they were later letters of Paul, would have been put toward the end of the section there. But Origen actually tells us why Marcion did not deal with 1st and 2nd Timothy and Titus, because they reason, you understand, like, didn't he bring up Marcion? Did I hear him right? I know it's on kind of a faster play. He brought up Marcion, not bringing it up. Did I understand him correctly? Okay. And so he actually said, like, this is what Origen says about this. The reason, so he says, as then philosophy has been brought into evil repute by pride, self-conceit, by also the gnosis or knowledge or false knowledge called by the same name, of which the apostle writing says, and he already established the apostle as Paul. So Origen already says it's Paul. O Timothy, keep that which is committed to your trust, avoid profane and vain babblings and opposition of knowledge or gnosis, falsely so called, which some professing have erred concerning the faith. That's 1 Timothy 6:20-21. And this is what Origen says. Convicted by this statement, the heretics rejected the epistle of Timothy. So the Gnostics and even Marcion and those that were tampering into this kind of theology did not like what was going on. Now, Marcion was in no respect afraid to start mutilating things that he didn't like. But they're telling you very early on that there were arguments about this and why heretics didn't touch certain books and did touch others. But there's no dispute as to whether or not the early church believed they were Pauline. And he says the consensus of scholars, the consensus of scholars, the consensus of scholars. One thing that needs to be said, and I hope your audience hears this very clearly, there is no consensus that has been done that did any kind of voting on this subject. The consensus of scholars is always changing. I'll give you a perfect example. If you were to take consensus of scholars on who believed Q was a legitimate hypothetical document that once existed, we have no evidence of, how many believed it existed back about 20, 25 years ago, the number would have been a lot higher than what it is today. Even secular scholars are starting to kind of let that one go, or they have less confidence in it than they used to. The consensus is an always changing thing. If you take the consensus of the whole entire existence of the document from the time that it was written to today, the consensus from the early church to today is against modern day consensus. The consensus has always been, for almost 1800 years, Paul. Just as the consensus has always been, Luke was written by Luke and Acts was written by Luke as well. So when you do the consensus, which people, which era, which timeline, where's our limits, where does this end? In doing that consensus, the closest thing I could find to a consensus about the Pauline Epistles specifically was at BNTC, which is the British New Testament Conference that gathered together to do Pauline authorship. And they did a survey at this group. Was Paul the author of these epistles, going all the way down? My friend Elijah Hickson shared this with me a while back. And you go to Romans, I mean, you had like about 107 to 110 votes per epistle. Romans was like 109 to 0, and 0 being uncertain, 0 being no, 109 said, yes, it's Paul. There's no dispute about that. And then when you get to 1st, 2nd Timothy and Titus, it's quite fascinating. You expect it to be like 100 say no, 9 say yes, or 3 say uncertain. That's kind of what you expect when you hear the consensus of scholars. Well, when you go to books like 2nd Timothy, for example, you have 26 that say it is Paul. Now, again, these are the top New Testament scholars in England coming together and talking about this stuff. 26 say yes. 58 did say no. But 24 say they don't know. They're not sure. So it's closer. If you take the uncertains and the yes, you really don't have the consensus saying, no, it's not Paul. You have a consensus that says, about a third of them are saying, we really don't know. We're not positive, or maybe even less than that. And then you have some saying, yeah, we do think it is Paul. And then you have the other half of that going in and saying, no, it's not Paul. So it's really closer to 50-50 if you take the uncertainty and the yeses, and then you take just the no's. The consensus that would say no is only about 50%. That's not a big consensus. And if you go down to Titus, same, almost identical numbers, a little bit difference and change. 1 Timothy, a couple of differences in the yeses and a couple of differences in the no's and a couple of differences in the uncertainties. It all equals about the same. It's not as lopsided as people keep saying it is. And again, what consensus are you taking? When did you start the vote? Who's allowed in the vote? Is this only seminaries? Is this only atheists? Is this skeptics and atheists only? Is this secular colleges only? Does this include all the seminaries and secular colleges? Is it just in the last 10 years? Is it just in the last 100 years? Is it in America and in Europe? Is it America, Europe, and in Asia? Like, where do we take this consensus? Where is the consensus? Stop using that statement. The consensus of scholars is not data-based. It is opinion-based, based on the majority of the popular speech that's coming out of mostly secular or only atheistic perspective. That their opinion does not have heavier weight than a Christian. Just because somebody's a Christian doesn't mean their scholarship is second tier. I get tired of that. I get tired of hearing that. That's not the way it works.
To hats off credit, he does quote scholars like Carson and people that are on the more conservative side, at least in this video. So he's not just like cherry picking his favorite skeptical scholars. So I'll give him that at least. But
not all of those scholars.
But this whole idea,
they're not so certain as he makes them out to be either. They're probably going to be more in a category of they're not sure. They might think that it's a pseudo Paul that has a lot of Pauline teachings that was collected, somebody published later. You have people like that have the opinion of him. They would still trace the teaching somewhat to Paul. Whether he physically wrote it or was alive when it was written is different. But they still don't just dismiss it as, oh, none of that is Paul. That's not Pauline at all. That's not some of the guys he's quoting aren't that, dogmatic. You know what I mean?
Yep. All right. Well,
go ahead and say, Eric, you're about to say something.
No. Well, I think we're already an hour in, so we could just keep going. All I was going to say is that I think a lot of times people conflate like epistemology with sociology, and they're just, it's like we're talking about a sociological fact that is constantly shifting. So
you can psychologize all you want, but you still have to deal with the data and the inferences and the arguments people make from the data.
Yep. All right, let's go. Let's keep going here.
I find this very interesting. Marcion's canon and P46 are two of the earliest collections of Paul's epistles that we know about, and neither of them contain the pastorals.
All right, well, we dealt with that. You keep going.
Is the author of 1 Timothy really quoting the Gospel of Luke when he remarks deserves his wages? Well, as we've already seen, this could very well be the case. A date in the early 2nd century would be plenty of time for the author of 1 Timothy to loosely quote the Gospel of Luke and then be loosely quoted by Polycarp later on. Even so, it's hard to be convinced of this. The Catholic theologian Raymond Collins suggests an alternative view, which is that 1 Timothy recalls a logion found in the hypothetical collection of Jesus' sayings known as Q. Since the saying about workers deserving their wages is found in both Matthew and Luke, it could have originally appeared in that hypothetical document. Perhaps an even more plausible scenario is that the author of the pastoral epistles had heard this saying being passed around orally, and he called it scripture because he mistakenly thought it went back to the Hebrew Bible. A.E. Harvey explains, quote, "What seems to have happened is that this writer was using stock arguments. One was the verse from Deuteronomy about oxen, which was now generally accepted as relevant about the payment of ministers. The other was a proverb, which Jesus had in fact used, and to which he had given his authority. It sounded like an old piece of wisdom, and so it was a pardonable error if the writer of 1 Timothy thought that it came from the Old Testament," unquote. So it looks like 1 Timothy just isn't too helpful here.
Stop. Stephen, I saw you shaking your head there.
Yeah.
Well, those hypotheses have no statement of origin. Again, that's a guess. That's all that is. It's a guess. It's first of all, there is no Q. Find it. Like, where is it? Is there any evidence of it? Has anybody ever talked about it? It's a hypothetical document. Again, a lot of people have abandoned that ship just in the last 5 to 10 years. Going back to this idea that, again, what we do have, I know that they don't want to talk about it or they call it bias. What do you want to put there? What we do have is statements where the church fathers do say that when Paul said, according to my gospel, he was talking about Luke. He says it in Romans, which would have been written around the same time. So it's very possible Luke and Romans were published around the same exact timeline and sent together. One in a gospel account, one as instruction, doctrinal instruction from that gospel account. I think that's very viable. Why? Because as I stated, we can kind of give a time frame as to when Luke would have been written based on the Muratorian and Anti-Marcionite prologue, and that's about the time Romans is written. So you have that. And then you don't just have 1 Timothy. You also have Paul utilizing the story that of Jesus on the night of his betrayal, doing the Lord's Supper there, the Eucharist, the passing of the elements, that is derived from Luke's wording and statements, not Matthew, not Mark. So it's clear that he's also using it there. Now, again, that could be slightly different because Luke was in the process of writing his gospel before it was published, and Paul also had that material. Remember, Paul wasn't there either. So Paul would have learned that from the apostles. He wasn't there with Jesus when that night happened. So that story had to come from the eyewitnesses. And yes, there is a connectivity that he is right about in there. Maybe they have the same source. His view is that same source is a unidentifiable hypothetical document that doesn't exist. My perspective is the easier one to get. They both talked to the eyewitnesses. They both had information from the eyewitnesses, because Luke could have never recorded this statement of a laborer is worthy of his hire from the lips of Jesus from his own perspective. He wasn't there. He could have learned that from somebody that was there. The same way that Paul learned about what happened the night Jesus betrayed at the Last Supper, on the basis of the eyewitnesses. So the commonality is not a hypothetical document that nobody can find in history. The commonality is they both, the writer of 1 Timothy and the writer of Luke, spoke with the eyewitnesses who were there. And that's why they have commonality. Why can't the commonality be eyewitnesses? Why does it have to be a hypothetical document? See, to me, that's more work to prove that a hypothetical, non-identifiable document at any point in history existed is the common denominator between these two texts, rather than Luke's material and Paul's material about what Jesus said and did came from the same people, the eyewitnesses. That is more easy. That is actually a better way to do history, and that makes more sense in light of humanity than to give a hypothetical document that we can't prove. The commonality is the eyewitnesses. Luke got his material from the same place Paul did, and Paul would have utilized that material in his travels because he was carrying a gospel account with him. And that's why he said in 2 Timothy, my gospel, and he talks about the seed of David going through the lineage, who is of the seed of David. Well, only two gospels have lineages, and that's Luke and Matthew. So it fits the description. Again, it fits the description. The burden of proof is not on us. We have to stop as Christians who believe the traditional and the historical documents we have from the early church fathers, the patristics. We have to stop acting like the burden of proof is on us. We have the citations. We have the chain of custody. We have the undeniable connection and evidence. We don't have multiple people being attributed to these gospels. We have one person being attributed to Mark. We have one person being attributed to Luke. We have one person to John. We have one for each. We don't have multiple names we got to sort through. The burden of proof is on them. And if they want to use the argument of hypotheticals, fine. But that's not a document. That's not how you do history. They wouldn't do that for any other work of antiquity. I'm telling you, as somebody who did his PhD work in historical documents, that is not how you do history in any other of the sources that we have in the Greco-Roman world, Egyptian, or any of the Assyrian. We don't do that in any other work of antiquity. It's the wrong way to do history. And the accusation on us is that we're biased when they really are biased on their end, because they want to disprove this as that so much that they'll go through lengths like hypothetical hoops, and they dismiss everything as just bias. That's the answer for everything. It's bias. Well, I mean, if I go to find the Quran, I'm going to go to the Muslims. That's not bias. They were the original recipients of the document. I'm not going to go to the Christians and ask them what they think about the Quran first. If I'm trying to find the origins and composition of the Quran in its earliest format and stages, I'm going to all of Islamic literature I can find, not Christian literature, Islamic literature. Why? It was documents. It was written to them. It was their prophet. That's where you go. It's not bias. That's good history. So that's the way we've got to approach these things here. And as far as dealing with all these other things, there's no dispute to the early church about who wrote these documents. It was Paul.
Awesome.
And I did an entire video on this, by the way. And maybe you could just highlight this one. I demonstrated from the comparison that happens, and I don't remember if you mentioned that in the video, is that there's too many differences in the syntax between 1st, 2nd Timothy and Titus. Doesn't he do that in the elongated version, Eric? Doesn't he talk about how the writing's different?
No, he doesn't. He just mentions it on a slide. This is the argument that he finds particularly persuasive that he's discussing.
Okay.
But he does list a host of reasons in one of the slides, and that I think is one of the reasons. 'Cause it's at least one of the most popular arguments that you hear.
Okay. Yeah, it is. And I did an entire video on the pastorals, and I actually spent a long time showing that the comparative work for 1st, 2nd Timothy, and Titus, which are personal letters to individuals that were beloved by Paul, comparing them to a corporate group epistle is an unfair comparison. If I were writing a letter to my wife or to my mother, the wording and the way I write that letter is going to look a lot different if I'm sending a thank you letter to my church, or an update on my ministry to my church, or some thoughts for the church. That's going to look very different between the letter I write to the church and a personal letter to my mom or my wife or my dad or something like that. So I think that's already a bad start. But the book of Philemon is a personal letter that is undisputed. So what I did is I took the syntax and vocabulary of Philemon, extrapolated every single word in it, and backtraced every single word in Philemon into any of the 3 pastorals to see if you could reproduce the book of Philemon from the syntax and vocabulary of the pastorals. So it's going to be different. We have to make it. It's not the same. It's a personal versus a corporate letter. Let's compare apples to apples. A personal letter, which there's no dispute to my knowledge on Philemon by most. Even in the polls you see, like in this one, it was 109-0. So Philemon is completely attributed to Paul. So that's undisputed by Paul. They're all agreeing this is his wording, his letters, his style. Can you can you reconstruct the book of Philemon from the vocab and syntax of the pastorals? And that's what I did. I actually did. It took forever, but I did it. I eventually got done. I did all the major words and phrases, which ended up being about 162. I did my same format. Red is identical matches. Blue is you can't find these retraced. And green is they're connected, but there's some good argument for both sides. And out of 162 words, 131 of them were exactly matched. You can find those vocab or syntax out of 162 in the pastorals. 23 in blue, 8 in green. So 23 out of 162 words could not be retraced from Philemon into the pastorals. And I have all the data for this. And then there's certain phrases that he uses in Philemon that is only in Philemon and only in the pastorals, meaning it's not in 1 Corinthians, it's not in Romans, it's only in the personal letters, which is really where you're starting to compare apples to apples. Because now you're taking a personal letter and you're seeing a style, or you're seeing a heart of an individual who calls him, like, for example, he calls him my child, the techno, the singular techno there in 110. Same word he uses in his adoration for Timothy in 1 Timothy 1, 2 Timothy 1, and Titus 1:4. He calls him the technon. These are my child, my son. These are the same terms, only used in that way, in a personal endearment to Philemon, referring to Onesimus, who has now become his child in the faith. Same words he uses for Timothy and Titus. Only in those personal letters he uses terms like that. And there's others, words like useful and Paul calling himself an old man at presbytos. These terms are only unique to the personal letters. So I have specifically set aside. So 88%, worst case, 88% of Philemon can be reconstructed by the vocab of the pastorals.
Wow, that's interesting.
It took a long time to get that data. I mean, maybe 6 months, but I felt like it was necessary to do because I got tired of hearing that argument. That argument doesn't work. I've done the data. I'm not afraid to share the data. It's a lot to take in, but I'm comparing apples to apples. I'm not comparing two different styles of writings. I'm comparing the same kinds of writings. And if the pastorals were Paul's wording, we should be able to reconstruct something of Philemon as writing to a person, just as he wrote the others to persons. But that's a side note. I didn't mean to get in that too much, but that video is on the YouTube channel. It's also on my podcast that you're going to put in the link, where I give a lot more specifics than the rundown I just gave you.
After the show, I'll take any of the links for the videos that you referenced. I'm going to put them in there as well. So remind me to collect those later on.
All righty.
All right. Are you guys ready for the next one, or do you have anything to add, Eric?
Yeah, no, I think he's going to start to get into the
Undesigned
coincidences, and so I'll have a lot to say here. So
yep, I figured as much. Cool. Let me add.
That means I got to take a break.
Yeah.
You've been killing it.
Yeah, no, awesome stuff.
All right.
So to give an example of what passes for an undesigned coincidence, let's look here at 2 Corinthians chapter 11, where Paul writes, quote, "At Damascus, the governor under King Aretas was guarding the city of Damascus in order to seize me, but I was let down in a basket through a window in the wall and escaped his hands," unquote. Compare this to Acts chapter 9, where we read the following story, quote, "But Saul increased all the more in strength and confounded the Jews who lived in Damascus by proving that Jesus was the Christ. When many days had passed, the Jews plotted to kill him, but their plot became known to Saul. They were watching the gates day and night in order to kill him, but his disciples took him by night and let him down through an opening in the wall, lowering him in a basket," unquote. And so some apologists think that this counts as an undesigned coincidence. As Lydia McCrew puts it, quote, "In this coincidence, the two accounts agree on core facts. The account in 2 Corinthians to that extent corroborates the information in Acts," unquote. When I read stuff like this, my first thought is that maybe Luke had access to the text of 2 Corinthians, or if he didn't have direct access, maybe he had heard the story told by someone else who did. In fact, the passages also contain some verbal correspondences, such as the combination dia tu tekos. And so these parallels reinforce the idea that, whether directly or indirectly, the author of Acts may have known Paul's version of the story. Strangely enough, though, the majority of scholars of all theological and critical persuasions have continued to resist the idea that Luke knew Paul's letters. They've apparently assumed that if Luke had known the letters, he would have made more specific use of them than he actually does. Not everyone agrees, though, and according to other scholars, there seems to be a growing tendency to acknowledge that the letters of Paul actually had functioned as sources for Luke's story. And we're seeing evidence for this right now when we compare the flight from Damascus episode in 2 Corinthians and the book of Acts. In my own personal opinion, and this is just my opinion.
Yeah, you can keep going. You can let him finish up. He's almost...
I think that Luke, for the most part, probably didn't use the Pauline corpus directly. Let me explain what I mean. Never does Luke quote Paul's letters substantially word for word, as if they were, so to speak, open on his writing desk. At the same time, though, it's hard for me to imagine that nobody who had read Paul's letters ever bothered to tell Luke anything about what they contained. As William Walker explains, quote, "The so-called independent tradition used by Luke that would account adequately for the various similarities between Acts and Paul's letters would itself almost necessarily be dependent, at least to some extent, upon these letters. Thus, Luke would still be at least indirectly dependent on the letters of Paul," unquote.
All right, you can stop right there. So... he's quoting Lydia. So I actually sent her the video just to get her thoughts. I wasn't actually going to send it to her because I already had a lot of notes, and I was almost even going to skip this part. But Lydia chimed in, and so I'm actually just going to quote her verbatim here. She says that the suggestion of dependence, either direct via reading or indirect via speaking to someone who read of the Acts account of Paul's escape from Damascus in 2 Corinthians, is particularly ill-conceived. The differences from the epistles are so striking that this passage has been used as an argument, as a contradiction between Acts and Paul's epistles. The most well-known of these reference to many days in Acts and to the 3 years of Paul's letter to the Galatians. Hats off apparently wants to wave his hand and to claim that somehow or other the author of Acts was using many of Paul's letters as sources via the indirect route of talking to someone who had read them, presumably, which seems very ad hoc, by the way. So presumably Galatians would fall into that category as well. Ehrman famously uses this to argue that there's a contradiction. There is no contradiction. It's pretty clear that the author of Acts only had a vague idea of how long it had been. If Paul himself was the source of the information in Acts on this point, which she'll return to in a moment, he apparently didn't say how long that time period was. The other salient difference is the attribution of the plot to the Jews in Acts and to the governor of Damascus under Aretas in 2 Corinthians. If one wishes to say that the accounts in Acts is even indirectly based upon the account in 2 Corinthians, one has to make an ad hoc theory that the indirectness is the cause of these apparent tensions. But why say that at all? Only if one is determined to have that based upon the other. Certainly, if the author of Acts were attempting to base his accounts on accounts in Paul's letters, he would have no reason to introduce such tensions. She goes on to say that Hatzoff introduces the rather bizarre idea that if the author of Acts talked to people who had read Paul's letters at all, this renders Acts almost necessarily dependent on Paul's letters. She said, "This is absolutely ridiculous. Dependence in the relevant sense needs to be more than you just talk to somebody who at some point had access to a given source. Dependence would have to mean that the author of Acts got his information about these matters from someone who in turn was basing his own knowledge of these matters on Paul's letters. What is especially strange is that Hatzoff seems to think that the author of Acts was indeed a companion of Paul, which he'll actually mention later. If that's the case, then why do this whole round the barn routine? And so why couldn't this account be the result of just talking with Paul, who emphasized different aspects of the event, as we all tend to do, in different accounts that he told at different times? The mention of this involvement of the Jews in the plot, for example, occurs nowhere in the epistles concerning this incident, but could have been introduced by Paul on a different occasion of telling the story. So a bit of a long quote there, but
What a thought.
Yeah, exactly. It's like this is way simpler of a theory than just like this proposed, well, a dude read the letter and then, he kind of got that information. I mean, again, that seems extraordinarily ad hoc. And because he had mentioned Lydia and kind of quoted her, I just wanted to get her 2 cents. And well, I got probably a little bit more than 2 cents there, but I think it makes much more sense of his theory than his theory.
What a thought.
Much more parsimonious.
He was dependent on Paul himself because he knew him. What a thought.
Yeah. Which is also crazy because, again, hats off. He actually, the whole series of videos that I was making recently was pushing back against this argument from Bart Ehrman that Luke was not really a traveling companion to Paul. That's Bart Ehrman. He doesn't think that Luke traveled with Paul or the author of Acts traveled with Paul. And yet he agrees with me that Luke is Paul's traveling companion. But yeah, just to introduce this kind of a crazy theory, I don't know. I mean, just because scholars suggested it doesn't necessarily make it a good theory.
Yeah. You ready to move on?
Sure.
Usually, though, the kinds of coincidences that Mr. Manning talks about in his YouTube videos appear to be just that. They're coincidences. Let me give you an example of what I mean. In 2 Corinthians chapter 3, Paul has this to say, quote, "Do we need, as some do, letters of recommendation to you or from you? You yourselves are our letter of recommendation," unquote. Now, Erik Manning thinks he's found, well, with the help of Lydia McCrew, of course, he thinks he's found an undesigned coincidence between this passage we just read and Acts chapter 18.
What's with this letters of recommendation business? Acts fills the details in for us. We read that after being instructed by Priscilla and Aquila, Apollos made his own journey to Corinth, and it reads, "The brothers encouraged him and wrote to the disciples there to welcome him." That's Acts 18:27. So that's where Paul is getting this from.
So in other words, the undesigned coincidence here is that Luke and Paul both happen to mention letters of recommendation. But is this really some kind of a surprising coincidence? Mr. Manning may not be aware of this, but in Greco-Roman antiquity, travelers often carried letters of recommendation from people their hosts might respect. For instance, people of higher rank petitioned peers for favors on behalf of friends or clients. I'll give you an example of what I'm talking about. Let's take this letter here, which is from Egypt and dates to the year 6 CE. Quote, "Apollonius to Serapion, the Strategos and Gymnasiarch. Many greetings and good health always. Isidorus, the one who is delivering this letter, is from my household. I ask you to consider him as introduced to you, and if he comes to you for anything, do it for him for my sake. If you do this, I will be indebted to you. Whatever you wish to signify, I will do without delay. Take care of yourself so that you will be in good health. Farewell." And so ends the letter. And we have numerous examples of letters just like this. You can find a few of them translated into English in the excellent monograph Letter Writing in Greco-Roman Antiquity by Stanley K. Stowers. We even have today 2 instructional manuals from the Greco-Roman period that offer suggestions for how to write recommendation letters. So in 2 Corinthians 3:1, was Paul referring to the letter recommending Apollos in Acts 18:27? I mean, anything is possible, and scholars have produced a number of conjectures like that. For instance, Johannes Belser once suggested that the letters of recommendation that Paul had in mind might have come instead from one-sided Jewish Christians, or maybe from real authority figures of the early church, which were misused by Judaistic teachers in some way. And sure, that's possible too. The problem is, though, it's all just conjecture. As Paul Duff explains, quote, "Given the ubiquity of letters of recommendation in Paul's world, there's no reason to assume that the some mentioned here in 2 Corinthians 3:1 would refer to apostolic rivals flashing impressive letters of recommendation around Corinth. Instead, the some could just as easily point to any individual in the ancient world arriving in a strange city with introductory letters," unquote.
All right, you can stop there. And so, really quick here, undesigned coincidences, in case somebody doesn't know, basically it's when 2 works by different authors interlock in a way that would be unlikely if one of them were copied from the other or both were completely copied from a common source. And so one book mentions in passing a detail that answers another. answer some question raised by the other, and they just fit together like a jigsaw puzzle, right? And so he's introduces this idea that like, okay, well, it could be this sorry, my screen has got messed up here, that it could just be letters of recommendation were a common thing back then. And okay, that's fine. The thing about undesigned coincidences is we're not saying that like, well, if you offer up an alternative hypothesis, well, that completely defeats the argument. There can't be any alternative hypothesis. No, it's that we're saying that this is a cumulative case. And I think it's kind of interesting that he picks on one that is probably one of the weaker ones, and he completely ignores the more strong ones, which if we have time, maybe we'll give some examples, or I can just refer people to the video. But the whole thing about Apollos isn't just about the letters of recommendation. It's also the fact that if you read 1 Corinthians 3:4-6, it says, for one says, I follow Paul, another says, I follow Apollos. Are you not mere human beings? But what if after all is Apollos, and what is Paul? Only servants through whom you came to believe, as the Lord has assigned each to his task. I planted the seed, Apollos watered it, but God made it grow. That's, again, 1 Corinthians 3:4-6. Well, if you turn over to Acts 18:24 through chapter 19, verse 1, it talks about there was a Jew named Apollos, a native of Alexandria, who came to Ephesus. And when Apollos wanted to go to Achaia, the brothers and sisters encouraged him, and they wrote to the disciples to welcome him. That's the letter of recommendation. And then it goes on to say in 19:1 that while Apollos was in Corinth. And so notice that it's not just about the letters of recommendation, but that Paul had actually been there first. We know that Paul was there first in Acts chapter 18 at the beginning of the chapter. And then Apollos later comes on and he argues with some Jews over like who is the Messiah, and he debated them publicly. And so that fits in with what we have. Apollos watered, but Paul is the one who planted, right? And so there's also the fact that in 1 Corinthians 14-17, it talks about, Paul says that I didn't speak with wisdom and eloquence. And he repeats this phrase in 1 Corinthians like multiple times. He downplays eloquence and wisdom, right? Well, again, that would probably fit really well in with this faction of people who are saying, well, I'm of Apollos, right? And so it's not just about the letters of recommendation. Again, Acts 18:24 talks about he was an Alexandrian by birth, an eloquent man, right? And so, sure, he can point to this idea that other people were writing recommendations, and that is an alternative explanation. But I'm bringing a host of different passages in here. So it isn't much of a stretch to infer that in that factional strife in the Corinthian church, those who criticized Paul were focusing on the fact that he was neither impressive in person nor very eloquent, as we see in like 2 Corinthians as well. And in contrast to that, they preferred Apollos. And these comments of Paul's fit with the account in Acts of that Apollos was an eloquent man whose gifts were especially appreciated in Corinth. And so he's just taking one part of the coincidence and he's completely ignoring the other passages that I brought in. And even if he's read Lydia's book, he would have seen that as well. So yeah, that's basically what I got on that particular part. So
cool. Are you ready for the next part?
Yeah, let's
try to power through here so we can get some questions.
Yep. Yeah, we've already been an hour and a half, so
sounds good.
But Erik Manning has one last line of defense.
Okay, stop right there for just 1 second. I'll be real quick here. One last line of defense? I mean, dude, you talked about 2 undesigned coincidences, and I have
how many?
Out of one last line of defense. Okay, there are, I believe, at least 20 in Lydia's book, just between Acts and the Pauline Epistles. Okay, so he completely ignores some of the stronger ones, right? And people can refer to my video on that. Dan, I'll be sure to send you the video. Yep. But I give multiple undesigned coincidences that prove that whoever that almost make it impossible for the person who wrote the book of Acts not to be a traveling companion of Paul. I mean, I think that some of them are extremely strong. Like take, for example, I'll just give this one really quick. It says that the brothers from Macedonia had came to Paul, and then he immediately stopped working and making tents with Priscilla and Aquila and gave himself fully to the word. This is in Acts 18, I believe 1-5, right? Where, and then in 2 Corinthians 7, he talks about Timothy and another person coming with him from Macedonia with a giant offering from another church, which we happen to also know is the Philippian church from Philippians chapter 4. And so, like, I don't understand why he's just kind of cherry picking and then just saying, well, now you just have one last line of defense. Like, dude, again, this is a cumulative case. You can't just take apart like two links in a chainmail, whatever vest or whatever, and say, well, that's it. I've removed your armor. Like, that's not how cumulative cases work. So anyway, go ahead.
Yeah, no, I was going to hit on that cumulative case thing, but you just did it. So here we go. Wait, is it up? Yeah.
Thinks the book of Acts is chock full of what he sees as very specific details which only a companion of Paul could have known.
The author of Acts gets a ridiculous amount of difficult facts correct regarding local places, titles, names, environmental conditions, customs, and circumstances. Classical historian Colin Hammer details 84 of these facts in his book, The Book of Acts, in the setting of Hellenistic history. Wouldn't these details be best explained by him being a traveling companion of Paul?
The author of Luke and Acts may have been a companion of Paul, though many, perhaps even most scholars argue against this hypothesis. Now, you might be thinking, since I tend to be skeptical of these kinds of traditional religious views, of course I'm going to side with the skeptical view here too, right? But to be honest, I tend to prefer the idea that the author of Luke Acts really was a companion of Paul, and this is due to the so-called we passages.
Right. Like, dude, you just don't like how we get.
In fact, these.
Anyway,
go
ahead.
Okay.
It's just I find it a little bit strange that he just kind of doesn't like the premises of how we get there, but he agrees with the conclusion in a way. But anyways, go ahead and continue.
The passages have indeed convinced some scholars that Luke was a companion of Paul. Even so, it's hardly a settled issue, and while virtually all scholars agree that the author of the we passages is claiming to be a companion of Paul, they disagree over the historicity of this claim and whether it's best applied to the author of Acts himself, or maybe instead to one or more of his sources. At the end of the day, though, all we really have is Luke's claims. We can either trust him or not. All of that being said, even if we do assume that the book was written by a companion of Paul, he himself doesn't appear on the stage until chapter 16, and even then only intermittently. And so he must therefore have been dependent on information from other people and sources. Unfortunately, we don't know what those sources are because Luke has successfully managed to conceal them beneath a uniform editorial style. And if we can't trace the sources of an allegedly historical work, we can have little grounds for liability of the information which it contains. He thinks we don't just have to take Luke's word for it. And that's because, according to him, Luke gives us a kind of corroborating evidence in the form of what he calls tiny details. Details which he's apparently read about in a blog post by Timothy McGrew, who in turn got his information from the book I Don't Have Enough Faith to Be an Atheist by Christian apologists Norman Geisler and Frank Turek. And then Geisler and Turek cite the biblical scholar Colin Hammer for their information.
Okay, stop. We're almost done.
Okay, so what kind of details are we talking?
Pause it. Yeah. So first of all, thanks, Stephen, for hanging out. I know we've gone an hour and a half, so I do want to kind of wrap this up. Man, there's so many things.
That was
Stephen, you already touched on the fact that Luke was in a position to know and interview lots of different people. So I don't think we need to belabor that because we know where Luke was. He was in a position to get all kinds of information. We know that he was interviewing eyewitnesses. So to just completely trash that is like, whatever. We don't have the name sources is, I think, a little bit odd. But the whole thing with Turek, this is hilarious. So I asked Lydia about this since I know Tim and I know Lydia. I'm friends with them. He thinks he got his info on external confirmations from Geisler and Turek's book. He says, maybe I can understand why he said that. Tim does. However, she assured me he has a hardcover copy of Hammer, and he has had it for years and refers to it directly. And he says, when I looked up Hammer in I Don't Have Faith to Be an Atheist, or Enough Faith to Be an Atheist, she said, I found that they do have a long list of external confirmations comparing it with Tim's blog post. And I saw that Tim and the Geisler and Turek do follow the same order. And for the ones that he gives and uses their wording, but that could be Hammer's wording as well. She didn't really look that up for the first part of the items. But what's hats off doesn't notice is that time and again, and you can see it when you compare the two, is Tim is adding a lot of dusty, learned details that are absolutely not in I Don't Have Enough Faith to Be an Atheist. This includes both further content and also references for inscriptions. And so Lydia not pulling any punches here. She says it looks like Hats Off was very hasty and rather triumphant about finding that a scholar like Tim was using a pop-level apologetic book and jumped to the conclusion to the notion that a long line of apologists are just taking each other's words for things. That, I get it from the blog post by Tim, and Tim gets it from Turk, and Turk gets it from Hemmer. And she says she finds this highly amusing, as in the case of the stories of Paul's escape from Damascus, Hats Off failed to notice the signs of independence. Only they are even more numerous there. It's obvious that Tim was working directly with Hemmer. So there's a little bit of irony there. So
yeah, and my thing is, it's like, okay, so you think it is a companion of Paul, which again makes sense, because if you're gonna just include yourself in there the whole time, you would start back in chapter 1. You wouldn't start in 16. Halfway through your narrative, you put yourself in there with the we us hours. The other question that needs to be asked is, well, who else would it be? All right, so you don't think it's Luke, but it was definitely somebody that traveled with Paul. But this person would have to be extremely educated to actually compile a narrative in this manner, in that manner. So, and then, I demonstrated this over and over again in my Luke and my Acts videos and research and writings. There are so many physician terms in Luke and Acts that are in no other New Testament writing. Acts, for example, I can just give you a few examples. The idea of being the diagnosis he gives of the perutos there with the attacks of what's known as a gastric fever. It's medically exactly. So somebody that's the we, us, and our that is there with these people in Acts 28 that had been healed. And Paul, when he was doing his work of healing these people, he's using terms that only somebody who had the ability and training of medical training to utilize in their diagnosis. And in doing so, practicing certain kinds of physician words from Malta. So Luke learned these somewhere, and multiple times he's quoting Gallo and Hippocrates, multiple attestations of Hippocrates. Even his opening in Luke's gospel, the treatise that he does in the opening is literally taking Hippocrates' opening to the healing arts and switching 2 words at the end for his intro. He literally copied Hippocrates' healing arts and added 2 nuanced statements at the very end of it to give it a nice little twist to his beginnings of his story. Over and over again, you see Gallo, you see Hippocrates, you see this ancient medicine terms, you see this diagnosis. Whoever it was medically trained. So who else would it be? All right, you think it's a companion of Paul. Who else would it be that has that exact ability to write that kind of treatise? That means they're extremely educated in writing, well equipped and trained in medicine and diagnosis and physician practice. Who else would it be when Paul mentioned the fact that Luke was a beloved physician who was with him? Who else could it be? And again, this goes back to the fact that who else has been named there? Nobody. And I like the point that I've heard before, and I've repeated it in my programs. Why Luke? Why would you make Luke up to be a gospel writer? He's not an eyewitness. He wasn't anybody special in the church. He's not a Paul. He's not a James. He's not a Peter.
He's not a Jesus.
Why would you use? Yeah, really. He's not. He's a second descendant disciple, if you would. Why would anybody use his name as a forge? He doesn't have any prominence in the church apart from a few shout outs that Paul gives him. That's it. He has no more of a shout out than any of the other names like Aquila or any of the other names that he just lists in the end of Romans, like Jason. He doesn't list it. Why Luke? Who would just forge Luke's name? All the forgeries that we do have that actually have names attached to them, they're all eyewitnesses. Mary, Judas, Thomas, Philip, James, John, Peter. Forgeries have apostles' names on them because they need to sell it. You don't put Luke's name on a forgery. what good is that? It just doesn't make sense. There's no reasoning behind it. But there's so many physician terms. Who else would it be? Paul only mentions one physician on his traveling team.
Cool.
You ready for the next one?
Yep.
Or to continue?
Yep. We're getting there.
Let's get to the end.
About here.
We gotta
Well,
take
Erik
questions.
Manning gives us a couple of examples.
Luke gets the proper designation for the magistrates of the colony of Strategoi in Acts 16:22, following the general term archontes in verse 19. He gets the proper term politarchs uses the magistrates in Thessalonica.
Mr. Manning is probably correct that Luke's uses of these terms were appropriate to the contexts. Let's look at these one by one. Regarding the term strategoi, Francis Haverfield explains, quote, "The magistrates of the Roman colonia of Philippi are called by St. Luke strategoi. This Greek word was generally employed to translate the Latin praetores, and as in some few cases the magistrates of a colonia were certainly called praetores, it has accordingly been conjectured that the magistrates of Philippi bore this title," unquote. And this conjecture has been partially confirmed by J.R.S. Sterret, who catalogued an inscription at Pisidian Antioch, not to be confused with Syrian Antioch, by the way, where the Greek word strategia is indeed used of the office. It was later discovered that the particular office holder the inscription referred to was named Saturninus Secundus, which allowed Margaret Hardy to date the inscription to the 4th century. So was Luke right to use the word strategoi for the Philippian magistrates? It seems a reasonable assumption, sure, and there's at least one piece of hard evidence we've seen to support it, even if it was located over 200 years after Acts 16:22 was written, and in a city almost 1,000 kilometers away from its setting, Philippi. As you might imagine, though, this tells us very little about whether the author was a companion of Paul. Well, okay, but then what about Luke's use of the Greek word politarchus to describe the city authorities in Thessalonica in Acts 17:6? According to Colin Hemmer, that's a term now abundantly attested from Thessalonica and other Macedonian cities, and we're about to see in a moment he's absolutely correct. Now, Erik Manning thinks this sort of thing makes it more likely that Luke was a companion of Paul. How else would he have known that the authorities in Thessalonica really were called politarchs?
It's not as if Luke could have easily looked these facts up like we can today. Obviously, Acts wasn't written in the age of Wikipedia and Google.
So the question at this point is whether the term was common knowledge. To find out, we can have a look at this chart here, where Carl Schuler has kindly collected 32 Macedonian inscriptions that all refer to politarchs, just like Luke did. The original chart was so big that it wouldn't fit in the slide, so I had to cut out most of the rows, but you can still see that this term politarchs wasn't some kind of specialized knowledge in 1st century Thessalonica. Not at all. As you can see here, the dates of the inscriptions range from the 2nd century BCE to the 3rd century CE, and they're attested in 13 different localities all over the Hellenistic world. And really, this is what most of Mr. Manning's examples are like.
Okay, so there's a few things here. Now we've reached the end here. First of all, no, it's not exactly what all of them are like. Okay, there's 84, and he's going to pick on one and then basically make some kind of a generalization that they're all like that. Okay, you can't do that. That's totally illegitimate. Okay, you have to go through things one by one. You can't just pick one and go, well, they're mostly all like this. Second of all, again, this is Lydia. I invited her on the stream. She just wasn't able to make it, but she did. She pointed out a pretty big blunder here. And anyways, there's a lot here, but Hatzoff did do a lot of work on this. He got a copy of Schuler's article, which Hemmer himself references, but he made a big blunder, which in Charity, she says she's going to assume was a good faith error arising from haste. He was so dazzled by the number of places where Schuler lists inscriptions confirming the term politarchs for an official that he wrongly thought this meant that they were found all over the Hellenistic world, and hence common knowledge that any ancient author would know the term. Both Schuler and Hemmer say that there are numerous inscriptions in Macedonia. Macedonia is a specific region by which no means corresponds to the Hellenistic world. In fact, none of the inscriptions listed in Schuler even come from Greece itself. All of them are from Macedonia, and the list is even headed that way, as we can see in Hatzoff's slide. She actually looked up every item on Hatzoff's slide and went back to Schuler's article, and all of them are actually found in Macedonia. Even Gortina, I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly, which was which is what you can find on Google, which is in Crete, turns out to be a different Gortina that Schuler is referring to. Schuler is explicit in stating that Gortina that he's talking about is in the ancient town of Macedonia. Greece itself was known in Achaia, not Macedonia. Schuler and Hemmer appear to be in complete agreement that this was a regional phenomenon in Macedonia. Unless we committed the slip of saying that this use of politarchs was particularly only in the city of Thessalonica, and nobody is saying this, there is absolutely no refutation here. Schuler documents inscriptions using politarchs from east to west across Macedonia, though some of them are from locations almost on top of each other, and Hatzoff seems to have thought that this means that the term was all over the place in the ancient Greek world and could have been known by anybody. But once we avoid the whole Wikipedia fallacy, that we could just look things up easily, and once we remember that references are found in fragments and in scriptures, not in some kind of central reference work, we realize that the most plausible way of knowing this term for Thessalonica would be A, to travel at least to Macedonia, and B, to have occasion to pick up the use of the term in that region, and C, to realize that it would have been used in Thessalonica. If the traveler had ran it only over on the western side of Macedonia, he would have been sure that it was also used in Thessalonica, the eastern edge of Macedonia. But in fact, we have numerous inscriptions showing that it was. Hatzoff seems to confuse the fact that we have ample evidence carefully collected in modern times, chiefly in the 20th century, of the use of this term in Macedonia with the idea that it was common knowledge in the ancient world. But this is by no means the case. The most obvious and simplest explanation is that the author of Acts was actually had encountered this word and used it in the context in which he reports it while he was in Thessalonica. And then secondly, there is something less important, and I'm almost done here, less important but slightly dubiously honest about Hatzoff's emphasis on the fact that he couldn't fit all of Schuller's line items onto his slide. He seems to be using this to make a rhetorical point that there were so many that it was common knowledge, but many of the items that he left out are also inscriptions from Thessalonica. There's nothing wrong by itself with Hatzoff shortening the list by eliminating additional inscriptions, pointing to the use of Thessalonica or other duplicate cities, although she says she thinks that he's eliminated some of the other places where multiple inscriptions were found for the same location. But there is something absolutely wrong with him doing it and then emphasizing that he couldn't fit all the items in the slide while making the argument that this term was used throughout the entire Hellenistic world and would have been known by any ancient author. That combination gives the impression that the inclusion of the missing items would only strengthen the case for his conclusion when that's not even true at all. And so there seems to be some kind of shenanigans, whether honestly or dishonestly, I don't know. I'm not to judge. Hatzoff seems like a pretty good guy, but there was a lot of homework that seemed to have got skipped over here that she pointed out. And again, this is 84 different facts. You can't just say, look, I found an alternative explanation, which we see wasn't even very well researched, and go, well, yeah, they're pretty much all like that. Like that's just, again, that's not how this works. I mean, if you look at Ephesus, there are like 12 different external confirmations that we have of all kinds of different things, like, you know, the fact that the name Tyrannus was attested from Ephesus in first century inscriptions, the shrines and images to Artemis in chapter 1924, terracotta images of Artemis, aka Diana, abound in the archaeological evidence. The expression the great goddess Artemis is a formulation attested in inscriptions at Ephesus. There's the fact that the Ephesian theater was the meeting place of the city, which Luke writes in 1929. This is confirmed by inscriptional evidence dating to AD 104. The correct title grammatus for the chief executive magistrate in Ephesus. The proper title of honor Neokoros was commonly authorized by the Romans for major cities that possessed an official temple of the imperial cult. The term Hatheos, the formal designation to a goddess. And that's just like a handful in Ephesus alone. We see these from basically chapter 13 on. He also completely ignores like the fact that like the shipwreck of St. Paul, right? There's a mention of a very small island named Cauda, and there's a lot to this. I have a whole video on it. But Cauda is this tiny little island southwest of Crete. And it's more than 20 miles west-southwest where the storm likely struck the travelers in the Bay of Masara. This is precisely where the trajectory of northeastern would have carried them. This isn't the sort of information that would have been inferred by somebody who wasn't carried there by the winds themselves. And what's interesting about this is that Ptolemy got the location for Cauda way wrong. He's a geographer of that time, very famous. He was off on his location. Pliny the Elder got the location wrong. The only ancient source that we have that actually got it right was in the book of Acts. It's Luke. And so, like, again, it's very cherry picky for him to just pick the ones that like he thinks he could easily dismiss. And then like when I give like the stronger ones, like there's no mention. It's just, you know, whatever. So that's basically it. I think
I think the point is that it's not one thing, it's an accumulative case, which I
Mhm.
don't think it's recognized in these rebuttals that were done. Is you were making a cumulative case. He was picking one or two things that could be considered iffy, but there's multiple things. I mean, the writer writes multiple times in addition to all of those things that Lydia has and what you've produced, is that when he's there, the we, us, and our, there's far more details when the we, us, and our guy is on the scene. I mean, even in chapter 28, the items on the ship, the description, the number of people that were registered on that ship. How did it, like, these are specific numbers. These are details. The
Mhm.
ships, the design of the ship, what it looked like on the front, how many people are on board, how many people made it off safely. It's almost like Luke was in charge of something, or make sure everybody made it. And maybe they trusted him as a doctor, that the health and well-being of everybody there. I mean, there's a lot of explanation. Like, there's
Right.
just put your mind to real life happening. And if you're on that ship and things that you would see and remember, he seems to recollect a lot when the we, us, and ours on the scene, whether you're talking about Acts 19, 23 through 24, verse 28 to 29. I'm going to have multiple lists of my own of just detail after detail when he's there that are not earlier on in the book of Acts, as if he was there himself and he was able to record these things accurately as a companion.
Right. Yeah. I mean, I think a lot of times, I think this is one of the things that skeptics seem to not get, is that with cumulative cases, we're talking about probability and not mere possibility. And they seem to have this weird idea that, like, there can't be any other alternate explanation in order for a piece of evidence to count. And then they'll focus on the weakest bits of evidence and then just dismiss the entire argument on grounds that we can think of a few scenarios that are compatible with the author still not being reliable. And again, McGrew mentions 29 design coincidences in the Pauline letters. William Paley mentions a lot more in Horai Paulini. Colin Hemmer lists 84 external confirmations in Acts. And we've always been saying this whole time that it's not just one or two. One or two could just be a genuine coincidence. But the point is that it becomes absolutely ridiculous when there's multiple over and over and over. We have dozens of them, to just say that it's like, just whatever. Like, and so, yeah. I think you want to take any questions, Than, if you have a couple more minutes, and then I think we should be good, man.
Yeah, let's take maybe like 2 or 3 here, and then we'll call it a night. So somebody earlier, let me pull it up here. Sort of, I guess, relevant here. Nidamos says the quotations of the Gospels took 100 plus years to aggregate. So all you have is so and so said so and so before. And then he goes on to say, people defend Joseph Smith's martyrdom today. So too early to be legend equals junk. Do you have anything to say about that?
What was the first one? That it took 100 plus years before they're getting quoted?
To aggregate.
What's he getting at? I'm trying to figure out which side of the argument he's on here, because
he's arguing against the reliability. So he's pretty much just saying, again, so he says this, then he goes, people defend Joseph Smith's martyrdom today.
Yeah, but I'm just trying to figure out the relevance there. Like, what?
I think what he's trying to say is it took too long. It took a really long time to aggregate all the quotations from the early church fathers. And so there could have been myth added on into the New Testament writings.
Except we don't have that. What we have is unity.
Yeah, it seems.
But we don't have that. That's the thing. Like, we don't have. I mean, what was added on? Say, like, for example, Papias, who was in the first century, who was a disciple of John. He wrote 5 volumes on the teachings of Jesus. We have fractions. I mean, fractions of what he had. Why did that survive? Because that was not the main material that was going to be utilized anyway. As I said, Luke talked about many accounts being produced in his day. Where are they? They didn't make it. And they almost seemed to not make it by the time Luke was writing, because he even said many had undertaken to use the aorist as if it was an attempt and a fail. So to me, I don't. We don't have that. We don't have the expansion pack. In fact, what we have in the early citation of these gospels is consistent unity, which was a lot of what I did in my dissertation, looking at Codex H, taking all the early church patristics that we have, particularly First Clement, the Didache, which is the full copy that we have of it in that manuscript, taking the 7 letters of Ignatius, looking at those and comparing them to the scriptures and seeing, were they quoting what we actually have? Are we actually quoting, and were they actually quoting from the same texts? And overall, yeah, they were. They weren't expanding or building. They were actually just quoting what was already before them, and all the way into the first century on many of those documents, going back to Clement and the Didache, and then early second.
Yeah. Okay. Oops. Let's see. Cafe asks if a critic.
He's a
is going
mysticist. I see his comment. So he's a mysticist.
Oh,
He says a mythological
that makes
man.
sense.
I actually debated Richard Carrier back in January on the historicity of Jesus. If somebody wants to check that out, and I mean, Carrier and I get along great. I mean, I have no problem. We've had a couple of occasions now we've done videos together, but that was our first ever full-on fledged debate on the historicity of Jesus, and it went well for either party. So feel free to check that out.
Cafe asks if a critic is going to claim that Luke isn't the author, shouldn't they be required to propose a specific author and provide evidence? And
Yes.
I think you and I think we would all agree. Yes.
Yeah. Well, yeah, that's been the argument all along. So you have to have a person of interest. Who's the person of interest? You can't just say anonymous. Okay. Well, how did the churches just get this hypothetical church, hypothetical writer, hypothetical audience, hypothetical bishop, hypothetical region? We don't know. We don't know the name. We don't know the person. We don't know the group. We don't know the church. We don't know the bishop that let it happen. We just know it wasn't these guys. We don't know anything else. We just don't know it. We just know it's not them. That's what it comes down to.
All right. Here's a good question. Job Apologetics, one of our friends, says, how would you resolve the alleged Theudas mistake in Acts 5?
Is that like...
I actually don't know what he's referencing.
I know what he's referencing. I'm just kind of blanking on how to verbalize it. It's like there's a time frame where like one Theudas doesn't fit with the Theudas that Josephus mentions or something to that effect. Job, Lydia did I know I keep referring to her, but I'll just wear the McGroupie badge and just own it. But there's a 3-part series that she recently did within the month called Did Luke Make Up Speeches on her YouTube channel. And I think it's in the 3rd installment of those. She gives her answer there, and I believe she thinks that it's possible that it's referring to a different Theudas. Now, my initial response to be would be like, is this some kind of like, I don't know, harmonization that seems to be forced and not really fit? And she gives some arguments on why she doesn't think that it's forced harmonization at all. And Lydia is not an inerrantist, by the way. So she wouldn't have a problem just saying Luke made a mistake, but she gives some reasons why. So I would just encourage you to check out that particular video.
So this is the argument pretty much shortened up here. In Gamaliel's speech, he mentions Theudas and Judas of Galilee. However, Josephus places Judas at about 86, in Antiquities 18:4-10, and Theudas at about 80:44, in Antiquities of the Jews 20:97-98. So how would Gamaliel in about 33 AD refer to someone who wouldn't lead an uprising for at least another decade? And why did he mention these men out of order?
Yeah. Again, she gives the answer there. There's other ways that people have dealt with this as well. I'm just off the top of my head. That's not one that I've spent a lot of time looking into. And I don't want to like articulate Lydia's views incorrectly. I just know she gives an answer. So you could check that out and let me know what you think. You know how to reach me, Job. So
yeah, the statement that has to be examined as well is that the names and Bauckham does a tremendous job of this in his work. The names in the Palestinian area were not broad and vast. Like, they were very small names. Like, Judas is a very, very common, one of the top 10 names of males in Israel. It would not be uncommon to have multiple people within that 100-year range in that area with same names either. So there are explanations. It doesn't have to be conflated as the same people, especially the name Judas being one of the most popular. I think it might even be in the top 5. I'd have to look at Bauckham's list. He does an entire
my upcoming video is talking about it, if I can find it quick.
And for Luke, like, for Luke to get that wrong would just be a little bit uncharacteristic of everything else he's done. I mean, he's not speaking futuristic. He's looking back at a statement that was made at a council meeting that was before him. So he was getting that information as a historian, probably from those that were there, right? Which would have been Peter or one of the apostles, that would be perhaps James, because he did run into James the Just. So where he got that information, he ran into Peter and he ran into James Just. He would have gotten it from them. So this would have been something that Luke probably would not have been as familiar with. He would have been completely dependent on another person for, because Luke was Syrian. He was from Antioch. This wasn't something that he would have been familiar with. He would have had to almost take Peter's word for it, based on putting together a report on somebody that was there. So to me, it goes back to where did Luke get that information? Luke is reporting at that point of Acts what he learned from people that were at the events, not what he saw, what they saw, not what he heard, but what they heard. So it's not that Luke would have known or not known. He probably wouldn't have known anyway. He's going off of what he would have learned from somebody, which more likely would have been Peter. Because again, we see instances where Paul would have been with Peter at the same time Luke was with him, spent time with him. So he would have gotten that from Peter, which would have been a well-known thing to them because they're Jews and they would have known about these uprisings. So the fact that, so it's really not Luke getting it. If it were wrong, it's not really Luke getting it wrong as much as his source getting it wrong. But his source being a Jew, knowing about uprisings, which were a very common thing in that time, would not be something likely that either Peter or James, one of those, James the Just, likely would have, or John, it could have been John. John was there too. Very unlikely that they would have gotten that wrong. It could be the commonality of names.
Yeah, Thaddeus. Wait, no, we're not looking at Thaddeus.
Judas.
Or Jude, Judas. They're all under the same.
Yeah, Judas was 4.
4. Yeah, I was right. So it was top 5. I thought 10. Then I thought, no, it's probably more like top 5. So it would have been number 4.
This is Theudas.
Theudas, yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'd have to look a little bit deeper.
It's probably not in that. And then Thaddeus was a surname for a lot of people too. So
correct.
Yeah.
Even the apostles having the name Thaddeus was a surname given because of the confusion with Jude. Judas, not Iscariot, because there were so commonality of that. You had so many Simons on the group. You had so many James. I mean, you had so many people the same. You had James, the brother of John. You had James the Less. You had Simon Peter. You had Simon the Zealot. So you had to give epithets. You had to give surnames.
Yep.
Thaddeus ended up becoming a surname for Jude. Not Judas Iscariot, but Judas not Iscariot, as John calls him. But he's called Thaddeus in other places because that was his surname in order to give distinction. So, again, commonality. It was not uncommon.
Yeah. Erik got to see the video I have coming out that's talking about this. So
it's excellent. Yeah, it's really good, man. Really, really good.
Awesome. Well, I think that's all we can do for tonight. Thank you guys for coming on and doing this. Thank you everybody for coming to listen. Do you guys have anything else you want to say before we kind of close this out?
No, just I would refer again people to my playlist on the Book of Acts. It's just Testify Apologetics. You can look it up. And then be sure to watch Hats Off entire video in context if you want further details. And thanks guys thanks Dan for hosting this. Thanks Stephen for joining. There was a lot of really good info there.
Yeah, thanks for dealing with the creepy, dark background.
Yeah.
Cool. Well, I'm going to close this out. Thank you, everybody, again. God bless.